So tonight I'm going to be talking about what triggers conflict for various Enneagram types. And so that's going to be the topic tonight. So while other people are joining us, I had a reason for doing that this evening, and why I wanted to do that is because really I think this has been a really rough sort of week in the United States with the death of another African American, and it's triggering a whole lot of different things yet again. I mean, sadly in the United States, we have these incidents that just trigger so many things in different people, and rightly so. I mean, this has been a really big and unfortunate sort of week. So tonight I thought it's a different sort of stress. So normally I've been talking about COVID-19 and the stress with that, but this, in the background, other things that are happening, issues of racism or police brutality, or some of the immigration issues or gun violence, things like that, that's still going on in the background. And so if you don't mind, I wanted to talk tonight about how the Enneagram can help us understand our responses, really, to some of the things that are going on around us. So just as people are joining, that's a little bit of the background. So if you joined early, or if you listen to this later, you'll understand why I sort of chose to take this topic. And I don't know about you, how do you feel about this week? You know, has it triggered in you some things? What are you thinking about this week? I mean, you're free to share that if you wanted to type in some responses. But it's life happens and we can't ignore it. Some people I've heard, don't want to watch the news, but it doesn't mean it isn't happening anyway. So those of us that are, trying to bring good and be good and act good, we get triggered too. So so some people are saying it's depressing to hear about yet more racist acts happening and things like that. It can be depressing. Some people are angry, some people are just frustrated or overwhelmed. So I just feel, okay, let's look at the Enneagram tonight from that angle, and let's see how it might help us, every one of us, to understand a little bit more about ourselves. So why don't we get started then this evening? So I'd like you to, maybe if you've got a pen, to think about this. If you do know your Enneagram type, or the one you most relate to, I'd like you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. So type 2, the helper; type 5, the investigator; and type 8, the challenger, are all squares. Okay, I'll say it again. 2s, 5s, and 8s are squares. And so I want you to put a square down there. Then 1, 4, and 7 are circles. And so I want you to know that 1, 4, and 7, that's the reformer, the individualist, and the enthusiast, are circles. So those 3 are circles. And that leaves 9, 3, and 6. So the peacemaker, the achiever, and the loyalist are triangles. So I hope you've got that in your heads. Squares are 8, 2, 5. Circles are 1, 4, and 7. And the triangles are 9, 3, and 6. So now I'm going to tell you what those things are. Okay, so what does that mean? It's just a way of grouping those numbers together. So the squares represent the Enneagram types that externalize when they're triggered. They sort of get it out, they speak it out, or they react out in an outward sort of way. So that again is the 8s, the challengers, the 2s, the helpers, and the 5s, the investigators. So they externalize when they are triggered. They tend to do that. The circles do the opposite. They feel those things, but rather than express it, they sort of turn it inward. So that's like the reformer, the 1, the 4, and the 7, which I'm one of those. We sort of internalize what we really think. Now that can be a little bit surprising because people think, especially my personality type, that I express everything I feel, but I actually don't. I express some of what I feel, but I can be feeling quite differently on the inside than what I think I'm showing on the outside. And I may or may not achieve that. So again, the squares externalize, the circles, the numbers I just gave you, internalize when they are triggered. So what do you think the triangles do? The 9s, the 3s, and the 6s. So what else is there? You either externalize or internalize your response to being triggered. So these 3 triangles, the peacemakers, the achievers, and the loyalists, they repress what they're really thinking and feeling. They don't internalize it, or they don't externalize it consistently. They repress it, and they may sometimes internalize it and sometimes express it. So the other numbers in those other groups generally follow a pattern of either externalizing or internalizing, but those triangles, they can repress it, and so you think they're okay with it, but they're really not, and they might internalize that or they might express it. And having lived with a 9 for many years, it's not unusual for Barbara to finally express something, express it and externalize it to me, and then tell me that she's been feeling that way for a long time, but she's never really expressed it, that sort of thing. And so if you don't know that about people you're living with, these are the people that you might not be able to predict what their reaction is. And so back to the beginning, this week with what happened in Minnesota, and pretty close on the heels of that, Barbara has had a really strong feeling about that. Like she said, I want to do something. Like if there's a protest, I want to go to that. So she is really wanting to express externally how she feels about that. But Barbara doesn't do that all the time for all the things she feels strongly about. It's inconsistent in that sense. It's not inconsistent in a bad way, but it's just the way it is. So if you relate to one of those Enneagram numbers, just think about that for yourself. Do I generally express when I'm being triggered? Do I get it out and just verbalize it or demonstratively show it? They would be those squares, the 8s, the 2s, and the 5s. Or are you more of an internal person? You sort of swallow your anger, or you can feel it in your gut and you sort of try and suppress it. So here's a news flash to you. Even though you think you're not expressing it, most of you, your body language and tone or your eyes do actually show that you at least disapprove, even if you don't verbalize it as clearly as others. And I know that because that's, I'm not aware that I'm externalizing what I feel often, and I'm one of those circles. And then the triangles, as I said, these are people that can sometimes internalize and sometimes externalize what they're feeling, and you really don't know what you're going to get. So I don't know if that's helpful for you to think about it like that. But so as we look at triggers then, what sort of things will trigger different personality types? So I guess this lesson today, or this topic I'm about to share with you, is one that you could think about the other people in your life if you know what their Enneagram types are like. But I really want you to really think about yourself more and see if you relate to these statements that I'm I'm going to share with you. So all the triggers that I'm about to mention are related to the emotional core, which we talked about right back in the first time I talked about. So, the triad of the 9 1s and 8s, the emotional core is anger. The triad of 2s, 3s, and 4, it's shame or that feeling of embarrassment. And the emotional core for the 5s, 6s, and 7s is fear or anxiety or that sort of thing. And so all these triggers are related to that. So I'm just going to go through and tell you what the Enneagram says are the common triggers for each of the types. And I would advise you to listen to all of them and think, is that me? Do I do that? Sometimes I do. And when you come to the type that's your type, pay particular attention and see, yeah, I do, I relate to that quite a bit. So I just wonder, it's only a suggestion. Now, what's the benefit of telling you this? I think if you know what triggers you, you've got more chance of working on things that would calm down those trigger points and realize I do have a button and it can be pushed. So here we go. I'm just going to start with the 1s. 1s are triggered, so a reformer is triggered by being told they are wrong. If you are telling a 1 they're wrong, they'll pretty well go on the offensive, and especially if they would take it as if you're attacking their character. And then their reaction, they may react, what it triggers is moralizing or scolding. And so they might actually give you a mouthful back and it will be, justifying why they're in the right. They would moralize, or they could be a little bit scolding with that. But other ones, instead of doing that, may retreat. They will internalize even more, and they don't want to display their feeling. They can feel that anger inside rising, so they'll retreat, and generally what they might do then is become cold and distant. So sort of give you the silent treatment, or literally remove themselves and become cold and distant. So 2s are triggered, and these are helpers, by the message that they're not very kind and they're not very helpful. That crushes them. And that by implication, all their efforts and their good work is not being well received. That will crush a 2 and will trigger them. And it's almost like the loss of face, and that's an Asian term, I hope you realize what that is, but a sense of shame or embarrassment that their best efforts have been rejected, and that will trigger them. So especially if they're being told you're not very kind, you're not very, because they really believe that's the motivation of what they're doing. 3s, the achievers, they feel triggered when they feel undervalued or their contribution is dismissed, and so it's not valued, and they also could become angry, and then they'll feel embarrassed about it, that their success or drivenness is misunderstood or undermined, because they are really like an engine and they're really trying to achieve, and they really are they're trying to work on what they think is most valuable. So when they get back the message that it's not very valuable, that really triggers them, and they can flare up and be angry, but deep down they're also embarrassed because they feel like they were trying to make a good impression and it all backfired, and so that triggers them. 4s, individualists, they feel triggered when they get misinterpreted or misunderstood, and or they sense when they feel that someone's angry at them or somebody wants to dump them. That triggers a deep, almost like a deep depression and shame, that when they experience that, and often 4s, surprisingly, even though they're depressed and sort of withdrawing, they can be very sharp and very articulate with their tongues. they're quite gifted usually at expressing their words. They're practiced in their heads a lot. So when they're triggered, it can actually manifest in hateful words being spoken back to the, like extreme hateful words or something like that. And this happens when they feel misunderstood or they feel abandoned. That can happen. Fives are triggered by the presence of expectations, especially when they feel like someone's expected them to give an emotional response, and that feels like they're totally cornered. So, if they are pressured into giving an emotional response and to display emotions, they hate that, and so that will trigger them. And so fives then will actually leave the room or walk away from the situation, sort of withdraw from that. Or if they're really cornered, they'd act like some animals do when they're cornered. They will become very angry and sort of and display anger, but that's not very common. It tends to be more a withdrawal in fives. So they're triggered when they feel pressured to give an emotional response. Sixes, the loyalists, are triggered by feeling mistrustful or feeling blamed. If they get a whiff that someone's blaming them for something, that will trigger them. And if they're feeling mistrustful of other people too, so they're not being mistrusted, they're mistrusting the people they're with. And so when they sort of start to move into that realm, it will trigger their response to people. And they become like a terrier, that would, I had a terrier dog that was hard to get a bone out of its mouth. If sixes are triggered, they'll start questioning, why are you thinking that way? What are you saying about that? They'll start to get very questioning, and really what's starting to happen is they're feeling abandoned, and they're also feeling insecure. And so what they're doing is they're trying to interrogate the reality they perceive is happening there. So again, sixes are triggered when they start to feel like they're not trusting the people they're with, and or if somebody starts to blame them, they will trigger in that way, and then they often retaliate with questions like that. Sevens, that's enthusiast me. No surprise, and it's really true. Sevens are triggered when they feel trapped and limited and try and flee the conflict, or may react explosively to break free of the negativity. So sevens when they feel trapped. So, when you feel your hands are tied, or when you feel your freedom's being cut off or something like that, that will trigger a seven. And so then they'll try and flee the conflict, or they will react explosively and then probably leave. That's how we do it. And that's what happens to us. And that's, again, the trigger is feeling trapped. And so it's really interesting. You might perceive you're trapped, but really you're not. So if you listen to last week, some of those practices that I mentioned last week are the antidote to some of these things I'm mentioning tonight. So let's go to eights. Eights feel triggered, and these are challenges when they are feeling controlled or dominated by someone else, or someone's trying to exert control or dominate them, or by feelings. The other thing that will trigger them is if people are abandoning them and abandoning the cause, or are disloyal to what we'd agreed upon. So they really sneer and really have a hard time. They're triggered when they feel controlled or dominated, or people are abandoning or becoming disloyal. And so what they tend to do, guess what a challenger tends to do? They sort of rise up and they try to over-dominate the other person. They can be aggressive, and they can also be very cold in the way that they talk to the person. And so it can be quite a unearthing sort of feeling when an 8 is doing that, right? So, and then for 9s, they are triggered when they're feeling internal chaos. Like they try and, as I said, they try and be people that compromise, give a little bit, but sometimes when those things don't work, and they're trying to bring peace, and they just realize that no matter what I say or do, it's going to be chaos, and I can't escape now. I'm in it, and I'm going to have to confront, and I'm going to have to do that. And so this triggers within them sort of an anger that they have to do that. And with the 9s too, they, you know, they prefer not to be in that place for sure. They like harmony, not chaos. But the reality in life, people, troublemakers in particular, what triggers a 9 especially, is the cause of the chaos. So they can really get triggered by a persistent troublemaker, especially if they're married to them. Let me just say that. And so not only that, but that really can trigger them into, unusually, but into anger, and sort of they can be quite volatile in their words and really tell people what they actually think. And you know, if you don't know a 9 well, you just work casually with them. But when that happens, you know it. You know all about it. So, going back to what I said originally, so you can see how what I just said aligns with external expressions, internal expressions, and sort of the in-between the 9, 6, and 3 that can go either one way or the other. So as you think about this material, as you think about using the Enneagram, how could this information help you manage what it is that triggers you? If I know I'm triggered by this, if I know that my particular reaction will be this way, one of the things that I feel is very helpful is to sort of, I don't want to say own it, but recognize it, and maybe talk about it, and maybe even think about developing some sort of strategies that would de-escalate when you feel triggered. Maybe you could share, if you're sharing self-awareness with other people, maybe you could say to them, when you see this happening, I really want you to ask me this, or I need space to walk away from this, or I just need you to listen to me and not advise me, or whatever it is. But I think you could use this Enneagram material to not say, well, that's the way I am, I have no control over that, and you know, you're going to get blasted because I'm a this personality, or you know, I'm just going to get in the car and drive away from the conflict, or whatever it is that you normally do. If you sort of recognize it in yourself and go, well, that doesn't lead to good things. Like, it doesn't actually build, it certainly doesn't build trust. And the reality is, everybody is triggered by some things. We're human beings, and as I said today, you know, this incident in Minnesota has triggered a lot of things, you know, a lot of different responses. And so there's a few ways we can apply it. First is work that out. The other way is, if you're living with people and you notice what their triggers are, I think, you know, it could actually stimulate you being a little bit more gracious and moving towards that person and helping them with that, and realizing it's extremely threatening for some people to remain in the conflict situation when all they want to do is run. But if they honor you by remaining, you affirm that in them. Or if they just blast verbally and say, okay, I'm hearing that, but what's really going on in your heart? You know, like, they're very angry words, but what are you feeling? You know, like, you can really help one another by, I guess, greater self-awareness and less, well, we've got to get off the merry-go-round of expecting everybody to act as if this is what I would do if I were them. That doesn't seem to work very, very well. It's better for us to understand the diversity that we have in the way that we're triggered and the way that we respond, and make room for one another, but also work on moving towards health. So if you didn't watch last week, I actually gave some practices that actually will galvanize you from giving into these triggers. I really believe that. And I hope you remember that. I'm not going to repeat it here, but you could play with last week's and write that down. If you have identified some of your behaviors in what I said tonight, then it might even motivate you to go back and listen again and see what are some of the practices that would galvanize me from really just reacting and being sort of out of control, or sort of falling into a groove or a pattern that you always fall into. This stuff can really help. It can really help leaders. It can help bring clarity into your life. This is what I'm doing, this is how I'm feeling, and help you to sort of channel those feelings of anger or shame or anxiety into something a little bit more positive. And especially if you're into spiritual formation, it can help you, sort of drive you in your relationship with God to sort of cry out to Him to help you overcome these things. So I hope this has been helpful this week. I hope that it's given you food for thought. And yeah, I just want to continue. I don't know how long I'll keep doing these sessions. A little bit of feedback from you guys would be good. I don't know if it's, are you finding the format helpful? I think 30 minutes, I can get a little bit said and done, and just a little bit by little bit. Actually, we're talking about maybe putting these sessions on a YouTube channel or something like that. But ultimately, though, I'm also interested in training people how to not just be a user of the Enneagram, but sort of develop skills in helping other people understand the Enneagram as a tool to help other people. I'm interested in sort of looking for people that might be interested in becoming sort of trainers, or people that would like to go down that route with the Enneagram in the near future. So I just thought I'd speak that out. So these are just little bits. Thanks, Jaso, for that feedback. I appreciate that. And I love that too. Kate's just saying she likes discussing the ideas with other people and folks. And yeah, I think that's good. I think even in talking about it with other people can be helpful as well. So, have a good week. And if you're around on Sunday, I'd love you to tune in. We've got our Pentecost, it's Pentecost Sunday, and I'm really feeling like God's giving me a pretty significant or pretty important message for 2020, the day of Pentecost, and what it means in the United States and for us as a church. We're at a crossroads, I think, in many ways, or I don't know if it's a crossroads, but new beginnings, and we need the power of the Holy Spirit to really guide and enlighten us. So I'm looking forward to Sunday. So great. Thanks, Eric, for your feedback. Thank you for coming tonight. 4 seconds to go, and we are out.